Inspector Pewbright arrived at St. Anselm's 5 minutes before the bell, which struck him as both considerate and faintly theatrical, doing nothing to soften the stone. Inside, the congregation arranged itself with polite hesitation, each person aware of being observed while pretending not to observe. Death in the parish was an occasion less for grief than for correct positioning. Harold Merton's coffin rested before the altar, plain, unadorned, and faintly apologetic in its modesty. The widow sat in the front pew, her black coat cut conservatively, her gloves removed and folded with care. Mrs. Merton's posture suggested attentiveness rather than sorrow. She nodded at each murmured condolence with the same expression she might have used when receiving thanks for a well-organized committee meeting. Pewbright, seated several rows behind, noted this with professional detachment. Composure, he knew, could signify many things, not all of them admirable. The vicar commenced the service with restrained solemnity, choosing words that conveyed respect without inviting inquiry. Harold Merton was described as reliable, steady, and valued, terms that implied usefulness rather than affection. The eulogy made no reference to intimacy, ambition, or disagreement. Pewbright reflected that such omissions were rarely accidental. Around him, heads inclined at appropriate moments, some in agreement, others in relief. A death that required no reassessment of the living was generally welcomed. During the hymns, Pewbright allowed his attention to wander, noting the subtle choreography of the pews. The parish treasurer sat 2 places from the aisle, his wife beside him, her gaze fixed firmly ahead. The secretary of the Ladies' Guild whispered once, then fell silent, apparently corrected by her neighbor's raised eyebrow. Several regulars were absent, their absence remarked upon only by the distribution of glances. One did not comment openly on who had failed to attend, one merely remembered. At the prayers, a Christmas newsletter slipped from a hymn book and came to rest by Pewbright's shoe. He retrieved it with mild embarrassment, folding it carefully before placing it on the pew. Its cover bore a cheerful illustration and a list of seasonal activities, including a forthcoming fund in memory of a valued parishioner. No name was mentioned. Pewbright considered the timing efficient. Commemoration, like charity, benefited from early organization. The service concluded without incident. As the congregation rose, there followed the familiar pause in which no one was quite sure who should move first. Mrs. Merton stood, gathered her handbag, and turned with practiced deliberation. Condolences resumed, offered in hushed tones, and received with unfailing courtesy. Pewbright watched as she thanked each speaker, occasionally correcting a detail, once reminding a woman to speak to the vicar about the hall booking. Grief, it seemed, had not interrupted administration. Outside, the cold asserted itself. Small groups formed, then dissolved, conversations carefully pitched between sympathy and discretion. Pewbright lingered near the porch, observing. The treasurer spoke briefly to the vicar, their heads close together, then separated with mutual smiles that did not quite reach the eyes. Someone mentioned the weather, someone else agreed. No one mentioned Harold Merton beyond the agreed phrases. As the widow departed, escorted by a neighbor who appeared both honored and inconvenienced, Pewbright noticed a momentary tightening of her expression when she passed the notice board. It was gone almost at once, replaced by the familiar calm. On the board, newly pinned, was a typed announcement regarding parish accounts, to be discussed in due course. Pewbright read it twice, then looked after Mrs. Merton, who did not look back. He left the churchyard with the sense that the funeral had accomplished exactly what it was intended to accomplish. Harold Merton had been placed in the ground, and with him, certain questions. Whether they would remain there was, Pewbright thought, a matter not of fate, but of convenience. Pewbright made a mental note, nothing more. But notes had a habit of accumulating. In parishes such as this, accumulation itself was often considered suspicious. particularly when everyone preferred matters pleasantly resolved. He adjusted his hat thoughtfully. Inspector Pewbright called on Mrs. Merton 3 days after the funeral, allowing sufficient time, he felt, for grief to become organized. The house stood on a respectable corner of Hawthorne Rise, neither imposing nor apologetic, its garden clipped into winter neatness. A wreath still hung on the door, its ribbon discreetly unlettered. The widow answered herself, as though preempting assistance. She received him in the sitting room, which had been prepared for visitors with restrained efficiency. Cushions were aligned, photographs dusted, the fire laid, but unlit. There was no sense of intrusion. The room suggested it was accustomed to being inspected, if not interrogated. Mrs. Merton gestured him to a chair that placed him squarely opposite her, a position conducive to conversation, but not intimacy. "I understand you are making certain inquiries," she said, once tea had been poured. Her voice was steady, her manner politely inquisitive, as though he represented a minor inconvenience rather than authority. "I am," Pewbright replied. "Largely procedural." "Of course," she said. Harold would have approved of that. This, Pewbright thought, was said too promptly to be entirely spontaneous. He accepted the cup she offered, noting that the milk had been added with careful exactness. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, posture erect but not rigid. If she was fatigued, she did not permit it to show. Pewbright began with generalities, how long they had lived in the house, Harold's habits, his involvement with the parish. Mrs. Merton answered without hesitation, her replies neither expansive nor evasive. Harold had been reliable, conscientious, perhaps overly attentive to detail. He had enjoyed being useful. She herself had encouraged his participation, believing it healthy for a man of his temperament. What temperament was that? Pewbright asked mildly. She considered. "Orderly," she said at last, "possibly exacting. He disliked loose ends." Pewbright nodded. He had heard such descriptions before. They were often applied posthumously, when exactingness could no longer be contested. He asked about the weeks preceding Harold's death. Mrs. Merton adjusted slightly in her chair, a movement so small it might have been coincidence. "He was occupied," she said. "End-of-year matters, accounts, correspondence. Parish affairs have their own calendar, as you know. Did he seem troubled?" "Concerned," she corrected. Harold believed concern was a duty. She smiled faintly at this, as though indulging a harmless quirk. Pewbright wondered whether Harold had shared his concerns, or merely carried them. He asked if her husband had mentioned any specific difficulties. "Nothing of substance," she said. "Certainly nothing that would require intervention." The word lingered. Pewbright made a note of it, though he did not immediately understand why. He asked about Harold's papers. Mrs. Merton rose at once, as though anticipating the request. She returned with a slim folder, its contents neatly arranged. "I thought these might be of interest," she said, placing it on the table between them. "I have already looked through them, of course. There is very little of consequence." Pewbright thanked her and did not open the folder immediately. He preferred to observe first. Mrs. Merton resumed her seat, smoothing her skirt with unnecessary precision. Her gaze rested on the folder rather than on him. "You were very efficient," Pewbright remarked. She inclined her head. "Efficiency prevents speculation," it was said without irony. Pewbright considered whether she meant to forestall his or others. He asked about the memorial fund announced at the church. "Oh, that," she said. "Entirely appropriate, I think. Harold would have wanted something constructive. And the funds will be directed how?" "That is yet to be decided," she said. "The parish committee will agree on a suitable purpose." Her tone suggested that agreement was inevitable. Pewbright wondered how often inevitability was manufactured rather than discovered. He opened the folder then, glancing through the contents without comment. Marginal notes, figures, dates. He closed it again. "May I take copies?" he asked. "Certainly," she said. Transparency is always advisable. There was a pause, the sort that invited a closing remark. Mrs. Merton did not fill it. Pewbright rose, thanked her for her time, and moved towards the door. She accompanied him, her manner unchanged. At the threshold she spoke again. "Inspector," she said, "I trust this will not be prolonged." He met her gaze. "That depends," he said, "on what presents itself." She smiled, politely, but did not respond. As the door closed behind him, Pewbright glanced back once. Through the glass, he saw her standing exactly where he had left her. Hands folded, expression composed. He wondered, as he walked away, what loose ends she believed had already been tied. The parish committee convened on Thursday evening, precisely at 7:30, in the smaller of the two rooms adjoining the church hall. The larger room was reserved for occasions of optimism, harvest suppers, jumble sales, the annual Christmas fair. This room was narrower, better suited to caution. Its table bore the faint scratches of past deliberations, and the chairs had been arranged with an unconscious fairness that nonetheless reflected rank. Inspector Pewbright attended by invitation, though the invitation had been phrased as an assumption. It was understood that he would wish to sit in, just as it was understood that nothing of importance would be said. The chairman, Mr. Avery, opened proceedings with a cough and an apology for the cold, which no one disputed. Coats remained on. Pens were laid out in parallel. The first item on the agenda concerned the Christmas raffle. Tickets had been printed, though distribution was pending clarification. This was agreed upon with general nodding. Pewbright observed that clarification, in parish terms, often meant permission. The secretary, Miss Dawkins, read aloud the minutes of the previous meeting in a voice that flattened emphasis. When she reached the section referring to Harold Merton's assistance with accounts, she hesitated, then continued without alteration. "Is that accurate?" Mr. Collins, the treasurer, asked mildly. "It is what was recorded," Miss Dawkins replied. No one suggested amendment. Pewbright noted that accuracy and record were treated as related but distinct concepts. The chairman cleared his throat again and expressed regret at Mr. Merton's passing, a sentiment echoed with varying degrees of sincerity. Mrs. Merton's name was mentioned once in connection with her fortitude, and then not again. When the accounts were raised, the atmosphere shifted by a degree. Mr. Collins spoke at length about seasonal delays, overlapping responsibilities, and the dangers of unnecessary scrutiny. He referred to Harold's role as informal, a word that seemed to reassure him. Someone asked whether the missing ledger had been located. Mr. Collins smiled faintly and said it had been mislaid rather than missing, a distinction that satisfied the room. Pewbright listened without interruption. He was aware that his silence was being interpreted as tact rather than strategy. The committee prided itself on transparency, provided it was conducted among the appropriate people. A suggestion was made that the memorial fund might absorb certain discrepancies once its purpose had been finalized. This was received with thoughtful murmurs. Harold would have approved, Mr. Avery said, as though invoking precedent. Harold approved of many things, Miss Dawkins added, then colored slightly and returned her attention to the minutes. The meeting proceeded. Decisions were deferred, responsibilities shared. Pewbright observed that no one directly contradicted anyone else. Disagreement was expressed only through qualification. When he finally spoke, it was to ask whether Mr. Merton had raised any concerns prior to his death. There was a pause, brief but collective. Mr. Collins adjusted his spectacles. He was conscientious, he said, perhaps overly so. Did he express that conscientiousness? Pewbright asked. Not formally, Mr. Collins replied. Nothing that required recording. Pewbright inclined his head. The distinction was familiar. Matters not recorded were rarely considered to have existed. The chairman thanked him for his interest and suggested that the committee would, of course, cooperate fully should anything arise. As the meeting drew to a close, coats were retrieved and chairs pushed back with restrained enthusiasm. Tea was offered and declined. In the doorway, Mr. Collins spoke quietly to Miss Dawkins, who nodded and glanced once in Pewbright's direction before looking away. Outside, the air had sharpened. Pewbright lingered by the notice board, ostensibly reading an announcement about choir practice. Above it, pinned slightly askew, was a typed sheet outlining forthcoming adjustments to parish accounting procedures. It bore a date from the previous month. Pewbright studied it, then stepped back. Through the window, he could see the committee dispersing, their conversation animated now that it no longer required minutes. He wondered, not for the first time, whether Harold Merton's concern had been with the figures themselves, or with the ease with which they were forgiven. Inspector Pewbright devoted the following morning to correspondence, an activity he regarded as both revealing and unnecessarily candid. Letters, unlike conversation, tended to disclose what their authors believed could safely be preserved. They were composed with an eye to posterity, or at least to the possibility of being read aloud at inconvenient moments. In parish affairs especially, the written word served as a compromise between honesty and deniability. He began with the letters of condolence received by Mrs. Merton, copies of which she had supplied with quiet thoroughness. Most adhered to a recognizable formula: expressions of sympathy, brief praise of Harold's service, assurances of continued support. What interested Pewbright were the variations. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly, as though agreed upon in advance. Others were conspicuously absent. No one mentioned the final weeks of Harold's life. No one referred to his work with the accounts beyond the vaguest acknowledgement. One letter, unsigned but neatly typed, departed from the general tone. It spoke of relief that matters have been settled and expressed hope that no unnecessary difficulties will arise. The Christmas stamp affixed to the corner lent it an air of seasonal goodwill that did not quite match its content. Pewbright read it twice, then placed it to one side. He next examined parish circulars and newsletters from the past 6 months. They were models of cheerful restraint. 50s were announced, committees thanked, responsibilities rotated. Harold Merton's name appeared frequently, always in connection with diligence and reliability. In the most recent issue, published shortly after the funeral, his name did not appear at all. Instead, there was a reference to recent events prompting a review of procedures. Pewbright noted that events like discrepancies were more manageable when left undefined. At mid-morning, he called on the postmistress, Mrs. Ellery, a woman whose professional discretion was widely admired and privately resented. She received him behind the counter, hands folded, expression attentive, but guarded. "You wish to ask about redirected mail?" she said without preamble. "I did," Pewbright replied, "particularly in the weeks before Mr. Merton's death." Mrs. Ellery pursed her lips. There was an increase, she said. "Nothing improper. Entirely at Mrs. Merton's request." "Discretion?" Pewbright asked. "Always," she said. "Some people prefer their affairs managed quietly." "Were there any letters returned unopened?" "One," she said, after a pause. "Marked not required." "From whom?" She hesitated. "The parish office." Pewbright thanked her, and did not press further. He had learned that reluctance often indicated loyalty rather than ignorance. As he left, Mrs. Ellery added, almost as an afterthought, that Mrs. Merton had been very clear about what should and should not be delivered. "She dislikes confusion," Mrs. Ellery said. In the afternoon, Pewbright returned to the station and arranged the papers on his desk with methodical care. He compared dates, cross-referenced names, and noted omissions. The Memorial Fund announcement caught his attention again. Its language was curiously provisional, as though awaiting instruction. He wondered who precisely was expected to instruct it. Late in the day, he received a call from Mr. Collins, the treasurer, who wished to clarify a point raised at the committee meeting. His tone was courteous, his explanation lengthy, and his conclusion reassuring. "There is really nothing to concern yourself with," Mr. Collins said. "These matters have a way of resolving themselves." "Do they?" Pewbright asked mildly. "In time," Mr. Collins replied. After the call, Pewbright sat for a moment considering the phrase. Resolution, he reflected, was often achieved not by addressing a problem but by redistributing it. In small communities, responsibility was diluted until it became palatable. As he prepared to leave, he noticed that the memorial fund receipt among Harold's papers bore a date earlier than the funeral announcement. It was a minor detail, easily overlooked. Pewbright held it up to the light, then placed it back. Outside, the day was already fading. Christmas lights flickered on along the high street, their cheerfulness unexamined. Pewbright walked slowly, hands in his pockets, thinking not of crimes but of habits. He wondered when, exactly, the parish had decided to commemorate Harold Merton, and what, by doing so, it hoped to put beyond question. Inspector Pewbright called upon Mr. Collins, the parish treasurer, on a grey afternoon that suggested neither urgency nor festivity. The house was modest, the sort of residence that might be admired for restraint if one had the inclination. Collins answered the door in a dark suit, his hair combed with care, and invited Pewbright into a sitting room that smelled faintly of sherry and polished wood. The fire had been lit but was already waning, as if it too had been enlisted in the service of propriety rather than warmth. "Inspector," Mr. Collins said, offering a seat. "Do sit. I thought it might be simpler to discuss matters privately." His tone was courteous, precise, and lightly apologetic, as though hospitality itself could be construed as an imposition. Pewbright seated himself and unfolded a small notebook, resisting the temptation to judge. "You wish to discuss the parish accounts," Collins began, "and any questions regarding Harold Merton's involvement." He poured tea with a meticulous hand, the faint clink of china punctuating the quiet room. Harold was diligent, yes, perhaps more diligent than was convenient. Pewbright inclined his head. "Did he express concerns?" "Not formally," Collins said, adjusting his spectacles. "Nothing that demanded action. Though he did remark, on occasion, that certain items might warrant attention in the future." He smiled faintly, the sort of smile meant to close discussion without inviting interrogation. I assured him all was in order, as I still assure myself. Pewbright noted the phrasing, the careful distinction between formal and occasional, and between assured and verified. In parish affairs, reassurance was often valued above accuracy, and accountability could be negotiable. Collins produced a sheaf of papers, tying them together with a ribbon of a subdued hue. "Harold kept his own notes," he said. "They are meticulous. Some might even say over-meticulous." He offered them to Pewbright, who accepted them without immediate inspection. "I trust this will be useful, though I doubt it contains surprises." Pewbright spread the documents before him, marginal notes, columns neatly aligned, dates that overlapped with no discernible urgency. Everything suggested order, if not resolution. He noted one entry in particular, a small adjustment to a parish fund, dated several weeks prior to Harold's funeral. The adjustment had been initialed but not explained. Collins noticed his scrutiny. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice measured. Harold was conscientious about the fund. Perhaps too conscientious. He had an inclination to formalize matters even when none was required. "Even when none was required," Pewbright repeated softly, observing the careful neutrality of the statement. Collins nodded. "One must allow for individual habits, Inspector. They are rarely dangerous, though occasionally inconvenient." He paused, then added, "The accounts, in their current state, reflect honesty as far as one may know it. The rest is conjecture." Pewbright considered the phrasing. Conjecture was a polite substitute for suspicion, and yet he felt that certain details were being deferred rather than denied. "Do you ever find the parish accounts unsettled?" he asked mildly. Collins inclined his head, slowly, as though agreeing without admitting. "Occasionally. At year's end, discrepancies arise, minor, usually, often attributable to oversight rather than malice." "And Harold?" "Harold was aware of them," Collins replied. "He may have hoped they would be addressed more promptly. But, as with many things, timing is flexible. He understood that. A silence settled between them, the sort that invited reflection but not disclosure. Outside, a faint wind rattled the sash window, punctuating the moment with the courtesy of distraction. Pewbright watched the treasurer carefully. Collins's composure was steady, his hands neatly folded, yet there was a subtle tension in the set of his shoulders, the slight tightness in his jaw when discussing dates. "You mentioned oversight," Pewbright said after a pause. "Is it usual for such matters to remain unresolved?" Collins sipped his tea and considered. "Resolution, Inspector, is often more a question of perception than of fact. Minor anomalies are acknowledged, recorded, and then, if possible, forgotten. Life, as you know, proceeds best when one does not dwell on trivialities." Pewbright made a mental note. Trivialities could be counted upon to conceal importance, especially when everyone agreed on their irrelevance. He leafed through the papers again, noting dates, initials, and annotations. Several entries stopped abruptly weeks before Harold's death. Nothing was missing in the conventional sense, yet the cessation was suggestive of an interruption. Collins cleared his throat. "I am aware that such documents may invite speculation. I assure you, Inspector, there is nothing to be concerned about." His tone was courteous, the assurance thorough yet faintly defensive. Pewbright allowed a moment of quiet, then remarked, "You have been meticulous in your explanations." Collins smiled, a fraction of warmth touching an otherwise formal expression. "I hope to be helpful. Accuracy is a courtesy, after all." The conversation drifted to parish duties, committee meetings, and the upcoming Christmas fair. Collins mentioned allocations, contributors, and a minor adjustment to the memorial fund. All was described in calm, neutral language, the sort of language that implied both transparency and discretion. Pewbright listened, noting phrasing that deferred responsibility while preserving appearances. As he rose to leave, Collins stood and extended his hand. "Inspector, I appreciate your attention to detail. It honors Harold's memory." "And your own diligence," Pewbright replied, shaking it lightly. Collins returned to his chair, adjusting his spectacles, and began to tidy the papers again. Pewbright paused at the door, glancing back. The treasurer's movements were precise, measured, as though each fold of paper and repositioning of documents reaffirmed both control and propriety. Yet the adjustment to the memorial fund lingered in Pewbright's mind, a quiet irregularity masked by otherwise flawless administration. Outside, the day was waning. Pewbright walked slowly along the cobbled street, noting the faint tinkle of church bells and the occasional passerby's polite nod. He reflected on the encounter. Mr. Collins had been courteous, precise, and superficially reassuring. Yet beneath the practiced calm, there had been the slightest hesitation, the faintest tightness in the language of explanation. A minor clue, almost invisible in its subtlety, suggested that Harold Merton's attention to detail had not been entirely mirrored by those who remained. Pewbright folded his notebook, the thought lingering like an unspoken question. In a town where discretion was prized above disclosure, what had been noted and deliberately left unresolved? The wind shifted, carrying the smell of damp leaves and winter coal. Pewbright continued on his way, aware that the smallest anomaly could unravel the most careful veneer of propriety, and that a single adjustment, quietly recorded and unremarked, might yet prove significant. The Christmas fair proceeded with its customary efficiency. held in the main hall of St. Anselm's under the auspices of seasonal cheer and parish duty. Inspector Pewbright arrived mid-morning, observing from a respectful distance the choreography of volunteerism. Tables had been draped with cloths of conservative hue, stalls arranged according to long-established precedent, and each participant had assumed a role that suggested neither improvisation nor excess enthusiasm. The air carried the faint scent of pine, wax polish, and something vaguely sugared, all combined with a subtle undertone of social vigilance. Mrs. Merton presided over her stall with quiet authority. She moved among the donors and contributors with a smile measured and even, offering thanks that were both courteous and exact. Pewbright noted the care with which she acknowledged each contribution by name, as though memory itself were a form of currency. Children approached with small coins, parishioners with envelopes, and each was received with identical grace. Her composure, unbroken, suggested that efficiency had become indistinguishable from decorum. Conversations at the adjoining tables proceeded according to convention. One committee member remarked, in a tone that suggested both recollection and discretion, that Harold Merton had always kept the books his own way. The words hung in the air, acknowledged with polite murmurs, and then promptly redirected toward the arrangement of raffle prizes. Pewbright reflected on the subtlety of deflection. In this parish, all potentially disruptive topics were acknowledged just enough to satisfy decorum, then neatly deposited aside. The vicar circulated, offering encouragement and gentle reminders regarding the church collection, his voice amiable but precise. Pewbright observed that the vicar's reassurances were intended less for practical guidance than for moral calibration. Parishioners nodded, their compliance more habitual than enthusiastic. No one questioned the process. To do so would have been an imposition upon communal harmony. Pewbright approached Mrs. Merton under the pretext of inspecting the Memorial Fund contributions. She presented the list of donors with unvarying courtesy, and he noted that the sums recorded were slightly higher than expected. "I see the generosity is considerable," he remarked. "It has been heartening," Mrs. Merton said, inclining her head. "Harold would have approved of careful stewardship, I believe." Her voice carried neither pride nor defensiveness, but a measured contentment that suggested control rather than sentiment. A schoolteacher, standing nearby, ventured a tentative comment on Harold's attention to detail. "He did like things orderly, did he not?" she asked. There was an unspoken suggestion that the orderliness might have been less than universal. Mrs. Merton's glance was brief but precise, acknowledging the observation while redirecting its implications. "Indeed," she said, "it is fortunate that many share that appreciation." Pewbright noted the subtle social equilibrium. Appreciation, acknowledgement, and redirection performed in a continuous loop. Questions were deflected without dismissal. Observations were noted without confirmation. Nothing was disputed, yet every remark contained the latent tension of an unspoken possibility. At the far end of the hall, a small group discussed the memorial fund's allocation. Words were chosen carefully, appropriate, considered, for the benefit of all. The phraseology was deliberate, ensuring that no one individual might be seen to exercise undue influence. Pewbright observed that the fund, though ostensibly communal, already bore the marks of implicit management. A minor incident occurred when a contribution was handed over in an envelope lacking a name. Mrs. Merton received it, inspected it briefly, and placed it atop the others, unremarked. Pewbright considered the significance of the gesture. It was an act of discretion, yet also of authority. She had acknowledged the gift without inviting further inquiry. The donor's anonymity remained intact, yet the act subtly reinforced her position within the parish hierarchy. By mid-afternoon, the fair had settled into a rhythm that suggested continuity rather than spontaneity. Pewbright walked slowly among the tables, observing the interactions, the nods, the whispered acknowledgements, the slight adjustments of posture when recognition passed unnoticed. He considered how much of the town's moral and social energy was expended on appearances, the careful management of propriety. When Mrs. Merton moved to replenish supplies at her stall, Pewbright noted that her glance fell briefly on the list of donations. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the faintest shadow of scrutiny, as though she were verifying not the generosity of contributors, but the sequence in which their contributions were recorded. A ledger lay open nearby, unattended, and she returned to her position without comment. Yet her gaze had suggested a minor anomaly, noticed and acknowledged silently. The day drew toward its conclusion with a gentle, habitual orderliness. The raffle was conducted with procedural exactness, the prizes distributed according to plan. Volunteers gathered their belongings, parishioners departed in small, courteous clusters, and the hall retained the faint impression of activity without disorder. Pewbright lingered for a final observation. He looked once more at Mrs. Merton, whose composure had remained consistent, yet whose slight hesitation over the ledger suggested awareness of a detail not yet shared. He wondered whether it was an oversight, an administrative irregularity, or something deliberately concealed. The question was minor, almost trivial, yet in a parish accustomed to meticulous display, trivialities often bore unexpected weight. As he left the hall, the air outside carried the faint scent of pine and winter frost. Pewbright walked slowly, reflecting on the day's observations. The memorial fund was intact, the donations generous, the parish cheerful, yet beneath the seamless propriety, a small anomaly lingered, a brief, almost imperceptible moment of scrutiny that had gone unremarked by others. He allowed the thought to settle quietly, like an uninvited guest, aware that in a community devoted to careful appearances, such a moment could prove as significant as any formal disclosure. It suggested that Mrs. Merton, while outwardly composed, maintained a vigilance that extended beyond mere stewardship, and somewhere within that vigilance lay a detail that, when traced, might illuminate the measures by which order, and perhaps secrecy, was preserved. Pewbright continued along the high street, noting the slow flicker of early evening lights in the windows. He carried the image of the ledger, the fleeting glance, and the subtle adjustment of the widow's posture. Nothing had been overtly revealed, yet a question had been planted, and it lingered with the quiet insistence of propriety unsettled. The fair had concluded. So too had the surface of communal cheer. Beneath it, a careful equilibrium persisted. And somewhere in that balance, Pewbright suspected, a truth awaited acknowledgement. Inspector Pewbright returned to the Merton residence on the morning following the fair, requesting access to Harold Merton's personal papers. Mrs. Merton received him at the door with the same measured composure she had displayed at the funeral and during their earlier conversation. Her black coat was exchanged for a sober cardigan, gloves replaced by hands folded with quiet deliberation. There was no suggestion of ceremony, yet the arrangement of her posture and the careful tidiness of the hall conveyed the sense that the house itself observed propriety as faithfully as its occupants. "I trust you found the fair satisfactory," she said, allowing a faint, polite smile. Her words were neither proud nor inviting. They existed as a formal acknowledgement of events rather than commentary. "It was orderly," Pewbright replied, and Mrs. Merton, as usual, attentive. He watched her hands adjust the stack of ledgers on the hall table, noting the precision of their alignment. In this household, attention was habit and control alike. She led him to the sitting room, where sunlight fell in narrow strips across a carpet patterned with careful symmetry. Cushions were straight, ornaments aligned with subtle insistence. On the central table lay a slim folder, tied with string, which she retrieved and handed to him. "These are Harold's papers," she said. "I have examined them myself. There is, I believe, very little of interest." Pewbright opened the folder with gentle care, noting the neat columns, annotations in pencil, and marginal remarks made with a ruler's guidance. Dates and figures marched in orderly sequence, yet several entries stopped abruptly in mid-December. The cessation was conspicuous only in contrast with the otherwise meticulous consistency of Harold's record-keeping. "Did he anticipate the interruption?" Pewbright asked mildly. Mrs. Merton tilted her head ever so slightly. Harold did not speak of it. He was occupied with the year's final obligations. Her voice remained neutral, yet there was a faint hesitation before the last word, a subtle punctuation in the rhythm of her reply. Pewbright's eyes lingered on a receipt for the memorial fund, dated several days before the funeral announcement. The entry was initialed but not explained. He placed a finger upon it, not as accusation but as a marker of curiosity. "An early record?" he asked. Mrs. Merton looked at the paper and inclined her head, almost imperceptibly. It must have been a matter of timing. Harold believed in ensuring everything was in order, regardless of circumstance. Pewbright made a note. Timing, in the small parish, often carried implications beyond the literal. Certain acts of foresight suggested awareness that was quietly assertive, and Mrs. Merton's acknowledgement of it hinted at comprehension without disclosure. He leafed through the rest of the folder. Correspondence, memoranda, notations regarding parish matters, all exhibited the same precision. Certain items were folded in envelopes, marked with names, while others remained unaddressed, as if awaiting attention that might never be demanded. "Would you say he was conscientious?" Pewbright asked, though he already knew the answer. "Excessively so," Mrs. Merton replied. "He feared that disorder, even in trivialities, reflected upon all of us. Perhaps he overestimated the consequences." She spoke calmly, with the faintest trace of reproach toward absent parties. Pewbright considered that phrase. Overestimation of consequences could serve as both warning and safeguard. In a town where reputation was paramount, even small misalignments were regarded as potential scandal. Harold's conscientiousness, and the widow's management of it, had preserved appearances, yet left unanswered questions lingering beneath the surface. "I notice some entries stop here," he said, indicating a point near mid-December. "Is there a reason?" Mrs. Merton's hands rested in her lap. He was preparing for the end-of-year committee reports. Beyond that, there was little to note. He did not expect to require follow-up. Her voice was calm, measured, yet the phrasing suggested a boundary not to be crossed. Pewbright glanced at the final sheet, noting small pencil marks that did not appear in any of the ledger columns. They were subtle, notations of verification rather than instruction. He looked up at Mrs. Merton. "Did Harold share his observations with anyone?" he asked. "Not in detail," she said. He preferred to manage them privately. Public discussion, he believed, invited complication. Her eyes met his briefly, then returned to the papers. Pewbright allowed the silence to settle. The widow's composure, uninterrupted, carried authority beyond grief. It was the authority of someone who managed not only memory, but expectation. Every motion, placing the folder on the table, smoothing the edges of the papers, folding her hands, was an unspoken assertion of control. A faint sound drew his attention. The clock on the mantel, ticking in measured intervals. Each second was precise, disciplined. Pewbright reflected that in this household, order was both moral and practical. He had seen Mrs. Merton exercise it in the public sphere during the fair. Here, it was personal, intimate, and absolute. "I wonder," he said quietly, "if we sometimes admire order at the expense of understanding." Mrs. Merton inclined her head. "Perhaps. But order prevents speculation, Inspector." "Speculation is rarely beneficial," Pewbright nodded, noting her phrasing. "Prevention rather than discouragement, benefit rather than propriety." He allowed the words to remain unexamined for the moment. He returned to the papers, reviewing entries relating to the parish accounts. Certain figures, reconciled on the face of it, bore the faint marks of adjustment. Dates were verified, signatures present, yet the annotations hinted at anticipation rather than completion. The subtlety of these signs was easily overlooked. They required a careful eye and a mind attuned to nuance. Mrs. Merton, noticing his attention, did not interrupt. She arranged her skirts and straightened a cushion on the adjacent chair, movements so deliberate they seemed to punctuate the paper's significance without commentary. Pewbright observed, noting that attention had shifted from content to presentation, a hallmark of vigilance. At last, he closed the folder. "I am grateful for your assistance," he said. "You are welcome," Mrs. Merton replied. "It is preferable, Inspector, that these matters be examined with care rather than conjecture." He rose, folding his notebook, and approached the door. She accompanied him as before, hands folded. At the threshold, Pewbright paused, considering the faint irregularities in the ledger, the subtle marks that suggested awareness, the abrupt cessation of entries. "Do you anticipate any further adjustments?" he asked, soft enough to be considered polite reflection rather than inquiry. Mrs. Merton's glance lingered on the folder, then returned to him. "Only those required," she said. The phrase was simple, yet it carried the weight of authority and discretion, the implication that some matters were, in her judgment, already managed. Pewbright left the house with the quiet thought that the widow's vigilance extended beyond public observance. She had noted more than she revealed, controlled more than she disclosed, and in that management lay both reassurance and question. The day was grey, the air carrying faint scents of frost and domestic hearth, yet the impression of the household remained vivid in his mind, ordered, precise, and subtly guarded. As he walked along the high street, Pewbright considered the ledger, the notations, the slight pauses in entries, and the widow's measured attention. One could observe discipline and diligence. One could also perceive caution, anticipation, and discretion. Somewhere in the intersection of those qualities, he suspected, lay a detail yet unspoken, waiting for circumstance or curiosity to bring it to light. The thought settled quietly with him, like a single unobtrusive shadow cast across an otherwise tidy floor. Inspector Pewbright arranged a small, informal gathering at the parish hall under the pretext of clarifying the recent adjustments to the accounts and reviewing the memorial fund's allocation. Invitations had been sent with the usual discretion, phrased to suggest routine consultation rather than scrutiny. The attendees arrived punctually, their expressions a mixture of civility and mild apprehension. There was a subtle understanding among them that appearances were as important as facts, that decorum could disguise uncertainty, and that politeness might avert conflict more effectively than inquiry. The widow, Mrs. Merton, was present, seated at the head of the table, her posture composed yet attentive. She spoke little at first, observing the gathering with the faintest inclination of the head that suggested awareness rather than judgment. The treasurer, Mr. Collins, took the floor first, offering explanations in measured tones regarding minor discrepancies, each phrased as a matter of procedural nuance. Some items were noted in Harold's personal papers. Collins began. They reflect conscientious attention. Nothing, however, indicates error or impropriety. His words were deliberate, conveying assurance while leaving room for interpretation. The committee members nodded in agreement, accepting the framing of diligence as the resolution of any issue. Pewbright listened quietly, noting the subtle choreography of acknowledgement. No one contradicted another, but qualification was permitted, a careful insertion of "as I understand it" or "to the best of my recollection" that allowed personal perspective without challenge. These qualifications were signals, subtle markers of both loyalty and concern. "I understand that some entries in the ledger ceased abruptly," Pewbright said. His voice was gentle, indirect, yet carried the weight of attentive observation. "Is there an explanation for this discontinuity?" Collins adjusted his spectacles and inclined his head, as though consulting memory before offering a measured response. It coincided with the year-end reporting period. Harold may have paused notation in anticipation of formal review. Nothing untoward, merely procedural. Procedural, Pewbright repeated softly, allowing the term to linger in the room. It was a word carefully chosen, its meaning layered, formal, routine, yet conceivably dismissive of underlying concern. Mrs. Merton intervened, her voice calm and authoritative. "Inspector, it is often prudent to distinguish between what requires attention and what does not." Harold understood this well. "We aim merely to preserve clarity without engendering speculation." Her phrasing was precise: clarity, preservation, avoidance of speculation. Each term reinforced propriety while subtly deflecting scrutiny. Pewbright noted the deliberate calibration, the insistence on procedure as a shield for unspoken matters. The discussion shifted to the memorial fund, contributions, and proposed allocations. Every suggestion was framed in neutral, communal terms: appropriate, beneficial to all, reflective of parish wishes. Individual preference was downplayed. Consensus and decorum were foregrounded. Pewbright observed that while the fund appeared to serve a collective purpose, its management already bore the quiet mark of Mrs. Merton's oversight. She consulted the ledger briefly, noting sums with a gaze that was efficient rather than inquisitive, yet the subtle pause suggested attention beyond formality. At one point, a parish officer mentioned a minor discrepancy in ticket sales for the Christmas raffle. The comment was framed with careful indirectness. "I may have misread the allocation, but there appears a small anomaly." The room collectively tilted toward reassurance. Mrs. Merton adjusted her posture slightly and said, "Minor misalignments can occur. What matters is their rectification, which has been attended to." Her words were precise and comforting, yet carried a silent emphasis. She had observed, noted, and controlled. Pewbright's attention lingered on the gestures, the glances, and the phrasing. Responsibility was diffused so evenly that it seemed to belong to no one, and yet the widow's subtle cues suggested she remained the central arbiter. Members deferred to her authority without contest, their politeness simultaneously a shield and an acknowledgement of oversight. The meeting drew toward its conclusion with a shared sense of closure, reinforced by conventional politeness. Tea was poured, biscuits distributed, and minor adjustments noted with discreet nods. No one left with their posture altered. Civility had been preserved. Yet Pewbright perceived the faintest tension in Mr. Collins' shoulders, a minor hesitation in Miss Dawkins' pen poised above her notebook, and a subtle narrowing of Mrs. Merton's eyes as she reviewed the ledger one final time. Before departing, Pewbright asked a closing question. "Do you anticipate any need for further review?" Mrs. Merton's glance was brief, deliberate. "Only as circumstance requires," she said. The phrasing was simple, yet its implication was layered. She reserved judgment, acknowledged oversight, and asserted control. It was neither evasion nor disclosure, but a carefully balanced position that conveyed both authority and discretion. As the attendees gathered coats and prepared to leave, Pewbright noted the choreography of exit, polite conversation, courteous bows, mutual acknowledgement, all performed to maintain social equilibrium. No one lingered on discrepancies. Every minor anomaly was contained within shared propriety. Pewbright remained seated, observing the ledger once more. Certain entries, though reconciled, bore marginal annotations whose purpose was unclear. Their presence was unremarkable to the casual eye, yet in a parish devoted to precision, even small details could signify intention. He considered whether the widow had noticed these annotations and chosen to preserve them without comment. A subtle management of both information and perception. When the hall had emptied, leaving only the faint scent of tea and polished wood, Pewbright rose. He walked slowly to the doorway, glancing back at the tidy table, the ledger, and the folder that contained Harold's notes. The room was orderly, controlled, and superficially resolved. Yet beneath the veneer, a minor irregularity persisted. A notation, a hesitation, a carefully measured glance that hinted at awareness not shared. Outside, the evening air carried the faint chill of approaching winter. Pewbright walked along the deserted street, reflecting on the subtle interplay of observation and omission. Mrs. Merton's authority had been quietly reinforced, not by overt command, but through vigilance, restraint, and the careful calibration of attention. The question lingered with him, unspoken and delicate, in a community where discretion governed both speech and action. What had been acknowledged silently, and what remained deliberately unexamined. The thought settled like a shadow along the high street, insistent yet unobtrusive, a marker that the true measure of propriety was not in the words exchanged, but in the things left unsaid. Inspector Pewbright found himself once more at St. Anselm's, this time under the pretext of reviewing the parish records for end-of-year submissions. The vestry was cool and faintly scented with old wood polish, its shelves lined with ledgers and binders that had accumulated dust with the same patience they had accumulated entries. Pewbright appreciated the steadiness of order, though he understood that beneath such surface calm could lie irregularities as subtle as a misaligned column. The vicar, who greeted him with a nod and the faintest lift of the eyebrows, had made no mention of his presence, leaving Pewbright the advantage of unobserved observation. He began with the ledger of charitable distributions. Contributions were logged with precision, initials, dates, amounts, and allocations followed in exact parallel. Yet some annotations in pencil suggested consideration rather than completion. A marginal note beside the memorial fund read only verify, without signature, date, or explanation. Pewbright studied it carefully. The absence of a signature indicated either oversight or deliberate ambiguity. He filed the observation mentally alongside other minor irregularities, aware that in a parish devoted to meticulousness, ambiguity was a rarity. Miss Dawkins, the parish secretary, entered quietly to deliver a small bundle of correspondence. She was courteous, her expression composed, yet Pewbright noted a subtle tightness in her jaw as she handed him the letters. She lingered only long enough to mention that the correspondence had been opened and sorted according to standard procedure, then retreated with precise steps. Her departure left the vestry in silence, punctuated by the faint rustle of papers and the ticking of the wall clock. Pewbright turned his attention to one letter, typed but unsigned, marked with the parish seal. It referred to the memorial fund and hinted at matters requiring oversight beyond the ordinary. The wording was courteous yet insistent, implying both responsibility and vigilance. He compared the date with entries in the ledger, noting that it preceded the formal announcement of the fund by several days. A faint dissonance emerged between written instruction and procedural observance. As he examined the ledger further, he observed that several account balances were reconciled, but accompanied by small adjustments in pencil. These were not errors, nor did they imply malfeasance, yet their presence suggested anticipation of scrutiny. Pewbright considered whether the adjustments reflected foresight, caution, or a subtle assertion of control by an unseen hand. He traced each annotation with a careful finger, noting consistency of style, pressure, and placement. Even minor details, he knew, were rarely accidental in such a context. The vicar returned briefly to check on the progress of his own paperwork. He spoke in measured tones, commenting on the diligence of record-keeping and the necessity of orderly presentation. Harold Merton would have appreciated attention to detail, he remarked, almost casually, yet the words carried acknowledgement that extended beyond tribute. Pewbright noted the understated weight of the statement. The mention of Merton's conscientiousness functioned as both praise and quiet standard. Mid-morning passed quietly. Pewbright reviewed a set of envelopes containing donations yet to be allocated. Their contents were modest, unremarkable, yet he noted one envelope marked only with initials, its sender deliberately ambiguous. The pencil notation on the ledger referenced the amount without linking it to any individual. The gap between contributor and record, though slight, suggested discretion beyond usual practice. He paused, recognizing that in the parish, Discretion was both moral obligation and mechanism of control. Miss Dawkins returned with a small bundle of handwritten notes. 1. Written in fine, precise script, detailed minor discrepancies in committee allocations. She placed it before him and spoke softly. "Inspector, these were forwarded for your attention. Though I believe all issues have been addressed." Her phrasing implied both deference and responsibility. She stepped back, her eyes briefly meeting his, revealing a shadow of caution, as though the contents contained more significance than protocol would allow her to acknowledge. Pewbright examined the note. It mentioned allocations, verification steps, and minor adjustments. Nothing was accusatory. Everything was framed in terms of order and propriety. Yet a subtle pattern emerged, a cluster of annotations in one hand, neat, deliberate, consistent, contrasted with a second set, less precise, in pencil. The juxtaposition suggested two different authorities at work, one formal, procedural, the other anticipatory, private, perhaps protective. A gentle draft from the open window carried a faint scent of frost, mingling with paper and polish. Pewbright considered the day, the patterns of notation, and the interplay of authority. Mrs. Merton's influence seemed apparent throughout the records, though indirect. She was absent, yet her attention was palpable in the subtle ordering, the careful recording, the maintenance of discretion. Control in a parish, he reflected, was often invisible but pervasive. He traced the pencil annotations to a point near mid-December, shortly before Harold Merton's death. Some entries stopped abruptly, others carried tentative notes with the word verify. Pewbright considered whether the notations represented foresight, anticipation, or intervention by a party whose identity remained unacknowledged. In a parish accustomed to meticulous observance, even the faintest irregularity warranted attention. The vicar returned once more to inquire after the ledger's status. He spoke with courteous detachment, though Pewbright detected a mild, almost imperceptible curiosity in his phrasing. "We all wish to ensure Harold's legacy is properly recorded," he said, choosing his words with care. Pewbright noted the careful balance, acknowledgement of diligence without suggestion of oversight or doubt. By mid-afternoon, Pewbright had compiled a mental map of the interactions, notations, and procedural gestures. The letters, ledgers, envelopes, and marginal notes formed a lattice of authority, discretion, and subtle vigilance. Mrs. Merton's influence was present in absence, her foresight exercised quietly through the channels of propriety. Each minor irregularity, annotations, ambiguous contributions, unsignaled letters, suggested attention to matters that, publicly, required no discussion. As he prepared to leave, Pewbright paused at the doorway and cast a final glance at the ledgers. The pencil notations, the faintly anticipatory adjustments, and the careful spacing of entries suggested vigilance maintained beyond the immediate sphere of public observation. A shadow of question lingered. Who had acted, or refrained, in the days before Harold Merton's death? And what had been quietly preserved, obscured, or anticipated? Outside, the winter afternoon had begun to fade, the air crisp with frost, and the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. Pewbright walked slowly along the deserted street, reflecting on patterns of attention and omission, discretion and authority. In a community where reputation governed behavior, he understood that what was left unsaid could be as significant as what was formally recorded. A minor detail, an initial, a notation, a hesitant glance, had suggested more than procedural diligence. It hinted at awareness maintained privately, a measure of control that remained unacknowledged but purposeful. Pewbright allowed the thought to linger, appreciating that in small communities, the subtlest gestures often carried the greatest weight. And so he continued along the high street, the ledger and letters safely noted, the question unspoken but insistent. Within the meticulous order of the parish, what had been anticipated, and by whom? The answer, he sensed, remained carefully concealed behind propriety, waiting only for a moment of curiosity or oversight to reveal it. Inspector Pewbright returned to Hawthorne Rise in the late afternoon, drawn by a desire to reconcile his observations from the parish hall, the ledger, and Mrs. Merton's own statements. The street was quiet, the winter sun slanting low across neat fades and carefully clipped hedges. He approached the Merton residence with the measured expectation of a visitor aware of both courtesy and control. Mrs. Merton answered the door promptly, her expression unchanged, composed, alert, and quietly presiding over her domain. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "I trust your day has been satisfactory." Her tone suggested neither enthusiasm nor reproach. It was a formal acknowledgement of purpose. "Indeed," Pewbright replied, stepping inside. "I hope to review Harold's final papers, if that remains convenient." She gestured toward the sitting room, where cushions, ornaments, and ledgers maintained their customary alignment. "Of course. I have kept them arranged as before," she said. Her phrasing implied care for both the documents and their presentation, a subtle reminder that order was integral to comprehension. Pewbright seated himself and opened the folder. At first glance, the entries appeared consistent with previous examinations: neat columns, dates, annotations, and marginal notes. Yet closer inspection revealed small irregularities he had not noticed earlier. An adjustment in the memorial fund, a penciled note beside an unsigned contribution, and a few entries abruptly ending midline. Each anomaly was minor individually, but collectively suggested deliberate discretion. "Did Harold anticipate any of these adjustments?" Pewbright asked, allowing the question to hover without accusation. Mrs. Merton folded her hands and considered briefly. "He was diligent," she said. "Perhaps he foresaw complications, but he did not discuss them. He trusted those matters to be managed discreetly." Her voice remained calm, measured, yet the choice of managed discreetly conveyed control extending beyond the immediate ledger. Pewbright noted the emphasis. Discretion, in this context, implied both oversight and authority. He turned to the penciled annotations, tracing the lines with a careful finger. They bore the subtle weight of someone checking, anticipating, or recording without obligation, an action intended more to assert propriety than to request correction. "Some entries cease abruptly," he said. "Is there a reason?" Mrs. Merton inclined her head slightly. Year-end obligations required attention. Beyond that, there was little to note. Harold believed in maintaining continuity, but understood that some matters resolved themselves. Her words were precise, yet contained a faint suggestion: resolution did not require discussion, and anticipation could replace communication. Pewbright considered her phrasing. Resolution, in the parish context, often involved silence rather than disclosure. Minor anomalies could be contained, attention directed subtly, and reputation preserved without overt intervention. He reflected on the interplay of observation and omission he had encountered throughout the past weeks. The fair, the committee meetings, the vestry records. Every circumstance was managed with formal attention, yet beneath the surface lay careful discretion. He reviewed the envelopes of donations once more. One, unmarked except for initials, had a corresponding pencil notation in the ledger that differed from the primary entries. The subtle divergence suggested attention exercised privately. Pewbright traced the notation, noting that it aligned neither with the formal entries nor with the public record. It existed in parallel, visible to those observant enough to notice, yet invisible to the casual observer. "Did Harold ever mention the memorial fund's early contributions?" he asked gently. Mrs. Merton's eyes flicked to the ledger, then returned to him. "He remarked only that accuracy was important," she said. "He did not specify timing or procedure. Such details were often left to the discretion of those involved." Her phrasing implied authority exercised quietly, with latitude for judgment. Pewbright observed the widow's hands, folded neatly and the faint tension in her posture as she monitored his review of the papers. She neither intervened nor directed. Her vigilance was subtle, exerted without overt display. The ledger, the annotations, and the early contributions were all under her awareness, maintained within her supervision. He compared the recent penciled notes with previous entries, noting a consistency in style and pressure that suggested a single hand had maintained oversight. Yet the absence of signature or explicit attribution allowed discretion to coexist with procedural formality. The faint irregularity of timing, the anticipatory notes, and the careful observation implied management beyond the records themselves. A sound from the hall, perhaps the closing of a door, caused Mrs. Merton to glance briefly toward it, her expression unchanged, yet attentive. Pewbright noted the flicker of awareness. Even the most minor disturbance was acknowledged and assessed without comment. Vigilance, he thought, was exercised as much through posture and attention as through words. He returned to the ledger, focusing on the early memorial fund entry. Its date, preceding the public announcement, suggested deliberate preparation. Pewbright considered whether the act represented foresight, anticipation, or control. The absence of discussion or notation beyond the penciled mark implied discretion maintained deliberately. "Inspector," Mrs. Merton said, her voice quiet but clear, "we aim for order, not speculation." Harold would have wished that. Pewbright nodded, recognizing the layered implication. Order here encompassed both records and perception. The management of fact and reputation. Discretion was not merely protective, it was authoritative, subtle, and comprehensive. He rose, placing the folder carefully on the table. "I am grateful for your cooperation," he said. "You are welcome," she replied. Her hands remained folded, her eyes steady. "It is preferable that matters be handled with attention and care." Her phrasing, like her composure, suggested both reassurance and quiet assertion. As he stepped toward the door, Pewbright glanced once more at the ledger and the annotated entries. The subtle inconsistencies, the penciled notations, the early contributions, all hinted at careful management not openly acknowledged. The widow's attention, exercised silently, maintained both propriety and control. Outside, the late afternoon had begun to dim, the low sun casting long shadows along the street. Pewbright walked slowly, reflecting on the intersections of observation, discretion, and authority. Mrs. Merton's vigilance had been constant yet unobtrusive, her awareness operative without overt interference. A minor anomaly, an early entry, a penciled mark, a hesitation in notation, had suggested more than routine oversight. The question remained unspoken. In a community devoted to careful appearances, what had been anticipated, managed, or preserved silently? Pewbright allowed the thought to linger, understanding that the smallest irregularity, the quietest gesture, often bore significance beyond immediate perception. The street was empty save for the faint echo of church bells. Winter air carried the scent of frost and coal smoke. Pewbright continued toward the high street, the ledger and its subtleties in mind. Somewhere within the disciplined order of records, letters, and attention lay a detail, deliberately managed yet concealed, waiting for the proper moment to reveal its import. The faintest irregularity, he knew, often signaled the greatest truth.